Hey everybody, Chris here, Ujoint Offroad, North Carolina. This is our new DIY four-wheel drive conversion instruction video. So watch as we convert this nice 2001 V10 to four-wheel drive. All right, as you can see, we've got the van up on the lift. The lift is not necessary for doing the four-wheel drive conversion, but it certainly helps. First step on this van is gonna be to pull the wheels and tires, pull the front bumper to prep for spring hanger, drilling, and then we're gonna get the transmission out. This van has a 4R100 transmission, which needs to come out and be converted to four-wheel drive. That requires a full rebuild, full teardown. So we're gonna get that out and send it off to the transmission shop first. All right, let's talk about dropping this front end out. Many ways to do this. I'm gonna show you how we do it here, which we believe is the simplest and easiest way to do it. So first step is we're gonna separate the steering. We're gonna take this nut out and this one off the pitman arm. All right, so he's got the cotter pins out. Just give that one a whack. Just like that. So he left the nut on the pitman arm, just a few threads, so you can hit the pitman arm to knock it loose. And that way, when it comes loose, it doesn't fall out and hit you. Next step is gonna be to cut the ABS line, and then he's gonna pinch off the brake line, pull the calipers. Then we're gonna take the radius arm bolts out, take the nuts off the lower shock, but leave the shock in place, and remove the nuts from the I-beam bolts. You'll also notice the sway bar is gone. We pull the sway bar when we pull the front bumper. So right now we're lowering the van down to the ground to drop the front end. Last step to get the front end out will be to pull that 10mm coil retainer, and then we're going to pry the shocks off of the radius arms. So Hunter's going to use a short pry bar to get that bolt out of the passenger side I-beam, and then we're going to go to the passenger side and pry off the shock. That'll drop the front end out. Go ahead. There you go. Now we're going to pick the van back up and carry all of this to the scrap bin. All right, here's a trick we learned several years ago. If you drill a hole through the shock shaft, right through the bushing and then through the shock shaft, you can get the shocks off like that. Makes it much easier. Putting shocks on E-Series is not fun if you've ever done it, and this is the quickest way to get the shocks out. All right, now it's time to drill for spring hangers. This is something that you can do while the van is still functional as a two-wheel drive. You just pull the front bumper and drill them. That's what we do here. We like to drill them ahead of time and then powder coat them before the day of install. But for this one, we're gonna drill it now and then we're gonna cut it. So here are the spring hangers. The spring hanger with the notch at the back is the driver's side. So let's get them in place and we'll show you how to line them up, clamp them, and then start the drilling process. All right, time to drill spring hangers. When you get the hanger up on the frame, you want to be about an 1/8 inch back from the bumper frame here, the bumper horn. And you'll make sure that your holes here are all lined up with flat spots of the frame. We're going to clamp it in place, and then we're going to center punch these outside holes. All right, we're going to start the process with a 3/16 inch pilot on the outside of the frame only. Now, before you start drilling the inside of the frame on the back, you want to give yourself some protection. So we're sliding that plate in place to keep you from drilling into the radiator. So get a block of wood or a piece of plate steel up there to give you a little insurance. Another trick for the inside is you want to be level as possible. There's a reason we don't provide holes on the inside, because it's super hard to get everything perfectly level to hit those holes. So the inside of the spring hangers, you will be creating the holes. So Hunter's using this drill block to keep himself square to the frame and the spring hanger. Then he's gonna go all the way through the frame and the spring hanger with 3/16. All right, so we're 3/16 all the way through. Another trick is, I didn't see it, but Hunter bent these horns up out of the way to give some room so you don't drill into the horns, and gives you room for the C-clamp. All right, so we're 3/16 through, front and rear, both sides of the frame. Now what he's gonna do is kiss all these holes with a 1/4 inch bit, because the hole saw he's gonna use to open up the outside has a 1/4 inch pilot. Now the real fun begins. So using a 3/4 inch hole saw, he's gonna drill all of the outside holes. So 3/4 on the outside only. All right, we are 3/4 on the outside only. Now, Hunter's gonna take a 3/8 drill bit and then drill out the inside to 3/8. We're gonna go 3/8 on the inside and then 1/2 inch on the inside. All right, all the holes are drilled. So now we're gonna do a dry fit with our 1/2 inch hardware. We're gonna get it in there and just make sure that everything lines up. It's not binding up or anything. If you have to, you can take a 3/4 inch drill bit, just deburr the hole to make sure the sleeves and hardware go through nice and smooth. So we're gonna do a full mock-up on all the hardware, and then you can go ahead and disassemble for powder coating. For this video, we're gonna go ahead now and get our jigs out and cut the shackle sleeves and show you how to do all the plasma cutting. All right, so we've got the frame prepped for the cutting and welding is gonna happen. There's where the shackle sleeve is gonna go, and there's where the upper shock mounts go. So we took it down to bare metal there. This is how the jigs show up when you get it from Ujoint. So this is the CK jig for the shackle sleeves, and this is one that we use here that is assembled. So you're gonna disassemble this guy and put it together like that. This is set up for 2 things. So if you're gonna use a hole saw, you can use this as your guide for your center punch, and then you can hole saw it out. If you're gonna plasma cut like we do, then you'll just start by plasma cutting these little tabs off, and then you've got your hole for the plasma cutter. It is offset to compensate for the torch head on a plasma cutter. All right, so right now we're moving the brake line and the ABS line out of the way to cut the engine cross member. You can take the clips out and then just gently pry it up out of the way, and then we're gonna place a jig. We're gonna clamp the jig to the cross member to use as a guide for plasma cutting. All right, engine cross member jig is in place and clamped to the cross member to act as a guide for cutting. This one had a lot of grease and dirt built up, so we cleaned it out the best we can, and we'll come back and clean it later and paint it all once we get the cutting done. All right, here's the CK jig in place. It's pretty simple. 9/16 bolt up front, hold it in place, and you slide it up to the frame. The point of this is to keep the shackle sleeve square to the spring hanger and not the frame. The frame is not straight right here. So to compensate for that bend in the frame, this shackle sleeve jig has an offset to keep you straight and parallel to the spring hangers. All right, cross members cut. Cut the heads off of the rivets that are in the cross member there. You need to be careful. On some models, these rivets also are part of the motor mount. So if your motor mount shares one of those rivets, you're gonna wanna put a piece of hardware back in there to secure the motor mount. Go ahead and hit it, Hunter. There it is, just like that. Now we'll clean up the cut edge and make it look pretty. All right, I'll try to get in here the best I can, but you can see he's got his shackle sleeve hole cut. Now the shackle sleeve is in place. He's using a level to get it squared and level to ground. He's gonna hold it in place, then tack it. You can tack on the inside and the outside, then you can finish weld. The transmission out is nice, we can get a good shot on the inside. Here's how your positioning goes on the inside. You're basically going to be flush with the inside of the frame on the forward edge of the sleeve. All right, final step of the welding process are the front upper shock mounts. So they are angled. You can see that they angle forward, and you center it on that existing hole that was the coil retainer. So I'm going to put them in place and weld them up. Here's the final weld for the shackle sleeve on the driver's side. All right, finished product. Here's a driver's side shock mount. Here you can see the angle a little better. The reason it has an angle is because of the push we do on our leaf springs you'll see later in the video. And it gives it a little more aggressive look. And it works better with the travel of the suspension once it is installed. So at this point, we are going to disassemble. We're going to pull the spring hangers off and send them next door to get powder coated. And then we are going to clean and paint the frame. Before we fully tear this back down and clean the frame, we need to remove that rivet. So this rivet has to come out for the upper track bar mount. So the way we do it is we cut an X in it and then use an air hammer to drive it out. All right, frame is cleaned and all prepped, ready for spring hangers. I get asked often how we make the frames look so good, and it's just old-fashioned elbow grease. Flap wheels, wire wheels. We get in there and get as much of the junk off as you can, and then we put them in a primer, and then we paint a semi-flat black. Everything that we paint, we use a semi-flat black. So, time for spring hangers. Fresh with powder coat from our fab shop in a BK59 black texture. That's what we use on everything we coat. So right now we're going to show you how to do a final install on the spring hangers. Here are the spring hanger sleeves. These get painted, so be sure to paint those. See a lot of guys miss that step. All right, using a dead blow, getting the spring hanger in place, and then you just bolt it up. Real simple. Shackle sleeve bushings, pretty self-explanatory. Lube them up with the provided grease. Push them in from each side, and then get your sleeve inserted. Let's talk about pitman arms. This is the pitman arm that we just pulled off of this van. So as you can see, this is what I consider an oddball, or not a common pitman arm. It's got the big teeth at 2, 4, 8, and 10 o'clock. So this is the pitman arm we're going to install, and I marked the teeth so you can see the differences. This one, the north, south, east, west, or 12, 3, 6, and 9, is definitely more common in what we automatically default send with kits. If your van is a 92 to 2007, you're going to swap the pitman arm. If it's an 08 up passenger van with roll stability control, you're going to keep the stock pitman arm installed during the conversion. If you have a 2008 to 2019 RV, you technically can change the pitman arm, and it's going to be this one if you do. So we've tried years ago to decipher the GVRWs and what makes a difference between these two pitman arms. And as soon as we found that info and tried to stick by it, we would get thrown curveballs, and it just made no sense. So we found the best way to do it is to send the more common pitman arm, and then if you need the less common pitman arm, you reach out to us, and we'll either send it to you in exchange, or we'll give you the part number where you can get it local. All right, new pitman arm is installed, and now it's time for the upper track bar mount. So you're just gonna remove those two lower steering box bolts, and then put them back in with the track bar mount in place. And then you're gonna take the 1/2-inch bolt and stick it up through the engine cross member where that rivet was you removed earlier. That is very, very important. That bolt has to be there. It triangulates the mount and adds a ridiculous amount of strength. Another thing I'm going to emphasize multiple times in this video is do not install the track bar until you have driven the van. I see way too many guys send me pics or having a question, and then the track bar is installed before they've even put the van on the ground. Don't do that. That'll put it in a bind, and you need to let the spring settle just a little bit. You don't have to do long, maybe 10, 15, 20 miles at the most. Then you can put the track bar in. But yeah, do not put the track bar in until the van has been driven. All right, time for springs. We've got our shackles loosely installed just by hand, and we're gonna get the springs installed now. The stickers go forward, and the stickers are always on the short side of the spring. So these front springs, you see you got your partial military wrap there, and the center pin is forward. right, so there we go. Front springs are in, and we are now ready for an axle. There's another detail that is somewhat important. This is how we tie up the brake and ABS line with some P-clamps, instead of leaving them all hanging looking terrible. All right, time for rear suspension. Pretty simple. We're just gonna remove these leaf springs and replace them with the new U-joint leaf springs. We've got this nice little cart that will set the axle down, and we also support the pinion so the axle doesn't flip around when we take the U-bolts and springs out. And we're just gonna R&R these springs. All right, here's the new springs versus the old. Pro tip here, what we like to do is set the springs out on the floor. It's really easy to get this bolt in the wrong position. So doing it like this, you're basically just gonna swap this shackle to that spring in the same orientation. While you have it apart, you wanna inspect your shackles. These don't look great, so we're gonna replace them. If you have cracks or it looks like the bushing is separating from the shackle, you're gonna wanna replace them. You can go with a stock replacement from Ford or Dorman, or check our website. We've got some HD shackle options coming soon. So in installing the new shackles, you're just gonna snug them up. You're not gonna get crazy with the torque wrench or the impact. Just get them snug so they still move by hand. Just like that. All right, another trick while installing rear springs. With this 6-inch lift, they like to close up on themselves the longer they've been sitting. So we've got the front spring eye bolt in, we've got the center pin sitting in the axle, and then we're gonna use a pry bar between the frame and the spring to basically flatten out the spring enough to get the shackle bolt in. All right, new U-bolts are in. Got the U-bolt plates dressed up, painted. Right now on this van, we're gonna stop here. We still have to re-gear it, and then we still have to clean and paint the rear axle. But if you're doing your conversion at home and your rear springs are in, you can move forward from there. If you plan to add airbags in the future, leave these U-bolts long. Add about 1 inch on top of the nut and then cut them. Or you can leave them like that. We prefer to cut them because it looks better, but you don't have to. All right, it is axle time. So we have several options for axles on our website. This is a stage 3 front axle, which is the Mac Daddy, best of the best. Our kit is also designed for you to get your own axle. So if you're getting to this point, we probably already discussed axles. You probably already have your axle set up and refreshed. There's several options as far as ABS goes and the years. This van doesn't necessarily need the stage 3 axle because it doesn't have roll stability control. But you can always upgrade to these parts on any van. So it gives you the bigger brakes, gives you the serviceable wheel bearings, 35 spline inner and outer chrome moly axle shafts. It's just all the good stuff that will help the van drive and be reliable and strong as possible for as long as possible. So here, because we have the lift, we roll the cart under it, and then we lower the van to the axle and attach it. All right, the axle is installed. We've got the U-bolts snugged up for now. We'll torque them later. And we're taking the strap off of our axle cart. And then we're just gonna pick the van up with its forever Dana 60. All right, our transmission is back from the rebuilder. It is now 4-wheel drive. This is a 4R100, so it needed a 4-wheel drive tail housing and tail shaft before it accepted the NV271T case. So it also has a VSS tone ring pressed onto the output shaft. That is very critical. That wire right there has to be installed. That's where your speedometer runs. So T-case is in, and we're going to get the T-case shifter jig in place. So you see that number 1 on the jig, that dictates it's for a 4R100 or a 5R110 transmission. So bolt the jig to the side of the transmission just like that, and then you're gonna trace your hole and cut your hole for the shifter. All right, so once the jig is removed, his hole was traced. He used an 1 3/4 hole saw at the front and the back, and then just use a die grinder to connect the holes. Now we'll clean out the insulation, cut a slit in it, and get the shifter in place. All right, shifter is in place. So this bracket is the TC001 shifter. It's got a little spacer behind here that works on all 4R100s and 5R110 transmissions. And then you've got your link, and it's pretty simple from there. Once we're inside, we'll put the boot and the knob on. Presses on there to T-case, and then there's a little provided nut to hold it onto the pivot side. All right, now to finish up the transfer case install, we've got our indicator light wiring. If you get a T-case from us, it'll come with this plug and the wires. So you're gonna wire that up to wherever you want your indicator light to be. You're gonna go 1 wire to power and 1 wire to the light. We also ran the vent. We've got 3/8 hose. We run it up the back side of the transmission and usually connect it to some of the transmission wiring harness. Here's the vents that we like to use. There we go, it's a GM part number. It's a little plastic vent. We use that for the front and rear differentials and the transfer case. All right, so with the T-case in, we are at the step now where we can measure for drive shafts. So the suspension, the rear suspension is at full droop, so it's physically impossible for this axle to move further forward. So we can get a good compressed length on this rear drive shaft. We've got our drive shaft order form that I made several years ago. It makes it simpler for us to order our drive shafts. So whether you're using someone local or one of the mail order places, let me know if you want a copy of this. Just email me and I'll send it to you. And it'll really help make things simpler and more accurate when ordering your drive shafts. So Hunter's gonna pull a dimension from center to center, flange to flange, which is, we're gonna say 50 3/4 to give ourselves a little cushion. And that's it. So CV shaft, got my flange dimensions, gonna be threaded on the CV head, drilled on the axle end, and there's our dimension. Now we can do the front. The front is best to do at ride height. We've done so many of these that I'm not gonna do it on this one because I already know what it is, but we prefer to have them down on the way to the springs before you measure for shafts. That helps get rid of any variables due to weight capacities and funny stuff as for like the extension housings on the transmission. They're always variable, so I always recommend to measure shafts once you're on the ground. All right, now it's time to finish up the rear axle. We've got the gear job done, and obviously the axle has been cleaned and painted, and this rig needed new brakes, so we've got new rotors, calipers, and pads in the back. So we're gonna show you how to finish up the rear axle with the shock mounts, brake lines, and wheel spacers. First, this is the stem eliminator. So the reason we use these is it gives you a lot more shock variety, and you don't have to rely on stem shocks in the top. So after you remove the stock shocks and the bushing, you're just gonna stick this in the hole here, bolt it up, and then you've got your new upper shock mount. Do that on both sides. All right, time for wheel spacers on this particular van. This van has a semi-float Dana 60, and we're changing the bolt pattern from 8 on 6.5 to 8 on 170. So wheel spacers get a bad rap a lot of the time because of the poor quality when you get a cheap spacer. These spacers are specifically made for us. They're billet steel, they're hub and lug centric. So Hunter's gonna grab this one and stick it on. We've used the provided Loctite on the stock studs. And then we're gonna slide this on, and then we're gonna put the nuts on and then torque it to 150 foot-pounds. So here's the most important thing about wheel spacers. This is a semi-float, so it's not an issue, but on a full float, these studs, the stock studs, will stick out past the wheel spacers. That is a big no-no. You cannot do that. So if you have a full float axle and you're doing the conversion from 8 on 6.5 to 8 on 170, you need to cut the tips of the stock wheel studs off. Your end goal is to make sure the stock studs do not stick past the face of the spacer. So that's it. I'm gonna torque them down. All right, let's talk about rear brake lines. So this van has a semi-float Dana 60, as you already know, and this generation or this year van has the driver's side caliper line is attached to the brake line T. So to resolve that issue, we send you the same as our regular brake line kit, the BL006, but it has an adapter to go to this line for the driver's side caliper. So this is the LBL006 brake line kit. The BL006 brake line kit is for RSC equipped vans that have the 2 brake lines dropping from the back. You leave those alone. You'll bend down the upper bracket and run the stock brake lines. When you're at full droop like this, you just bend the bracket down enough to give yourself a little bit of slack, and that's plenty. Same for the RVs. We leave the stock rear line in the RVs. The BL006 kit is just your 2 front lines and this single main rear line. Hope that makes sense. All right, now back to the front end. Shock install is pretty simple. FS001 hardware kit. This is the shock that ends in part number 004. 068 are the rear shocks. The brake line is bolted up. Pretty straightforward brake line install. This is a stage 3 axle, so the fitting is here in the center. If you're doing your own axle, or you got an axle that doesn't have this upgrade, just like a regular stage 2, the brake line fitting is gonna be up here. Doesn't matter, they're the same lines for all of our kits. Up here, bolts right up to the stock location. You're most likely gonna have to grind the coil bucket down a little bit to get enough room to get the clip in behind this brake line fitting. We usually reuse the stock brake line fitting. It's a little easier to work with than the one that the brake line manufacturer provides. ABS wires. So on this particular van, we've got the ABS sensor coming out of the knuckle, and then we took the stock ABS line and cut it. It's about, I don't know, 8-9 inches from the end, from the plug, and then we're just gonna solder them together. This one is nice and simple. We got a black wire and a brown wire. Gonna solder those together and then plug this up to the factory plug right there. Steering. The drag link has been painted with the ends installed. They only go in one way. This is the longer end and it goes to the pitman arm. Short end is down at the knuckle. Same ends on all of our steering kits, whether you have a stage 3 or if we sent you the steering knuckle, it's the same stuff. Be sure you paint the drag link. I see a lot of guys not paint the drag link, and then it looks terrible and rusty real quick. All right, it's time to drill the hole for the sway bar. So we're gonna drill a hole 4.5 inches forward of this body mount. Your height isn't critical because the sway bar links are adjustable, but we like to sit it on the flat surface of the frame above the curve, so you don't have a washer hanging off the curve of the frame. Check the inside, make sure there's nothing in the way. Some vans have fuel lines or electrical connections in there. You wanna make sure you avoid that. Now we are going to drill this hole square to the frame, not like the shackle sleeves. So again, because you're using a Heim joint on the sway bar and you've got some adjustment there, so it's not critical for it to be square to the spring hanger. So now we're gonna drill this out to 1/2 inch. Here are a few small details while wrapping up the front end. We like to use these Dorman throttle return springs for a carburetor. Just put a little tension on the brake line and keeps it from getting into the tire. And the front differential vent, pretty self-explanatory there. We run it up next to the gearbox and attach it to the wiring harness on the cowl. All right, let's talk about exhaust. So this is a V10 van, as you know, so it does need exhaust mods. All of your gasoline vans need exhaust mods to become four-wheel drive. And the reason for that is to make room for the front drive shaft, which is gonna go right here, and for the transfer case. So the stock exhaust is definitely in the way. The only exception to that are your 92 to 96 vans with the 460 V8. So this is how we do it here. Now this van is a nice setup because it's got the single cat here. So we didn't have to package the cats in this area, which we do depending on how the van's set up, but it gets to be a tight fit. So we make a new crossover pipe there. For this one, to make up for the difference in the length, we put a resonator. We like to do that on the V10s. We put a resonator on the passenger side exhaust, and then we run into this Y that is made by MagnaFlow, and then back to the stock system, which doesn't need to be modified. So, like I said, a lot of variables with this particular van. This is how we did it. You're gonna have some vans that have 2 cats, 4 cats. It can get a little bit complicated, but it is definitely possible. Another thing I'll get to later in the video is fuel tank shortening. This van has a 4R100 with the NV271, so it does need the fuel tank to be shortened to make room for the T-case. During this process, you lose 3 gallons of capacity. Not a big deal, but I will show you in this video, or maybe a separate video, our process for shortening the fuel tank. This is a new tank from Dorman. Tanks are more available now than they ever were. So it makes it a bit easier, especially if you're not doing it yourself. You can buy a dormant tank for a few $100, send it to a local welder. They won't have any problem welding because it's never had gas in it, and you can get the job done. Our fuel tank shortening template comes with the kit, and some vans don't need fuel tank mods. Those would be your late model 5.4 vans with the plastic tank. Like I said, with a lot of these things on these conversions, there's a lot of variables. So if you have questions, please email me, chris@ujointoffroad.com. All right, well, it's time to wrap up this video. I hope I covered everything and answered questions and made the process a little simpler for you guys. As always, if you have questions, you can leave them in the comments or shoot me an email, chris@ujointoffroad.com. Like I said several times during the video, there are a lot of variables with the vans. Our kits cover 1992 to current E-Series production. That's a lot of variety, a lot of different engines and transmissions. So there are going to be variables, so don't get confused. Just email me if you have questions. So I made myself a quick little cheat sheet from where we left off in the video. The drive shafts are in. This van is basically ready to go home now. So what we've done is we've got 1350 CV drive shafts front and rear. We've aligned it. We've got an 1/8 inch toe in on the alignment specs. Your positive caster should be in the 4 to 6 degrees range. You shouldn't have to do any alignment cams. The stock cams are fine. Sometimes on some rigs we might add add some shims to add a little more positive caster. Again, that's on a van by van basis. The track bar is installed. I mentioned earlier, I see a lot of guys install the track bar way too early. You need to drive the van before you install the track bar. If you don't do that, the track bar is going to be a bind as the springs settle in, which is going to cause negative handling and could break the upper track bar mount. So drive the van good 10-20 miles before you install the track bar. We've got a checklist that I'm going to show you here in a second. That is in our instruction sheet that comes with the kit. That's a checklist that we run through before we take any van out of the shop. It's just simple things. Check your cotter pins, torque your U-bolts, make sure everything's hooked up and tight. It's just a good way to double check everything. It's a lot of work. Transmission fluid, check your transmission fluid, obviously, before you get on the road if the van requires a transmission rebuild. Gear oil, we use the 80W90 straight gear oil in the differentials. Also in the instruction sheet is what we recommend for service intervals for the transmission, transfer case, front differential, rear differential. Check for exhaust leaks. Common exhaust leak area would be the passenger side exhaust where it connects to the manifold. Make sure you're good there. What else? Attach the sway bar links on the ground. That keeps them from being in a bind. Often when it's on the lift, the sway bar can be a little cockeyed, so you want to set that up on the ground, adjust your links to make sure they are basically neutral at ride height. And torque your spring bolts while you're on the ground. Torque specs will be in your instruction sheet also, but it's always good to have the weight on the springs, torque the U-bolts, and then torque them again. What I tell customers here when they take the van home is, they're usually driving, 700,000 miles plus home. I tell them to do a checklist and torque everything once they get home. So that's it. This thing drives great. It is ready for its new life, headed out west. Here's a copy of our checklist. So this is the checklist that we do before anything leaves the shop, and often we'll do another checklist before the customer picks it up. So thanks again for watching. We appreciate the support. Hopefully this helps you out. Email me, put it in comments if you got any questions. Just let us know how we can help. So North Carolina shop is where all the DIY stuff comes from, and we do turnkey installs here. Colorado shop is installs only. So be sure to reach out to those guys or visit those guys if you're in that area and you're looking for a turnkey installed out west. So thanks for watching. Ujointoffroad.com. See ya.